So the first thing I wanted to talk about was there's so much written about you, and you've done so many interviews talking about a lot of the work you've done now, and more recently, a lot of the stuff you did in the 80s and 90s is documented, is visually. But apart from an interview in Dazed where they asked, where was your interest, where did your interest originate? And you said it was because you girls thought it was cool. I couldn't find a great deal more that actually from your mouth was talked about, how did this start? Why did I get into graffiti? What happened with writing on trains? Where did this come from? Right from your earliest memory, just sort of giving me an idea as to, how did this all start?
I mean, well, there is other stuff kind of about more 80s stuff. It's very rarely about Remi Rough, because Remi Rough only kind of came into being in the sort of early 2000s. So prior to that, it was just Rough. But I guess, I got into graffiti art through being a teenager in London and needing some kind of vent of culture and belonging, and graffiti was there. It was kind of, it came over with hip hop, like much in the same way that the rest of Europe got it, and I just picked up on it and I think, the whole, and I am involved in kind of all aspects of hip hop. I still am, even as an almost 50-year-old man. But graffiti art was the thing that really piqued my interest. And a kid came into my school in 1985 with the book Subway Art. Was it 1984? No, it was 1985, I think. And he had the book Subway Art, which was the first kind of documentation of New York train painting by Henry Chalfont and Martha Cooper. And I was just blown away, and I was like, I want to do this. I want to be part of this. And I was never into the vandalism side of it. I didn't want to be a vandal. I wanted to make art. Yeah, and so I was really interested in the kind of graffiti art and the that visual element that came out of New York, and I was quite starstruck by it all. And I guess the mad thing is, like, some of those guys in that book and in the documentary Style Wars are like some of my best friends now, which is blows my head apart. I've got I don't know if you can see behind me, I've got a Mayor 139 sculpture, who's one of my best friends, and he was like 13 when they made Style Wars, and then it's just mad.
How does that journey happen then? Because you're a kid from South London, you start writing, and as you say, like, relatively short period of time, you're calling some of these people your mates. How does that happen?
I wouldn't say relatively short time. I think it's perseverance. It's like I met Mayor in 1999, so by that point, I started graffiti in 1984. So I've been writing for 15 years at that point. To me, it was essential that I became very, very good. I needed to be as good as I could possibly be at the, and that translates to everything I do, like with music or with art. Everything I do, I want to be as good as it possibly can be. And if it isn't, I'm fuck that. I scrap things. Because to me, perfection is such an underrated aim and achievement for so many people. It's like it's achievable, but so many people don't try and get to that. And I always try and get to that. I don't always get to that, but I always try and get to that. And with style writing, I had to be as broad and diverse and as different and as original as I could possibly be, because the art form's there. People write their names, and they stylize their letter forms and shapes, and they add 3D or shadows and characters. It's a formula. Everyone was doing it, a lot of people bite, which is called, you know, biting, copying. I couldn't do that. I had to be as original as I could possibly be. And there were points in my graffiti career, which is kind of weird looking back, because it's completely different to my art career in a lot of ways. Yeah, you know, I was constantly striving to be as good as I could possibly be.
You said something interesting in there about the vandalism aspect. Because I think it's so similar to something Zen said about how when he was picking up graffiti, for him it wasn't about tagging or any kind of one-upmanship or vandalism. For him, it was about beautifying areas and warehouses, and actually it was more that sort of street art sort of theme. So, do you think there's a natural progression to street art, and it's kind of okay? Because I've read a lot of people saying, you know, more sort of, I guess, in inverted commas, traditional graffiti artists don't like that kind of transition. They don't like that shift.
It's a hard question, but it's actually a really easy question as well. It's a very different conversation, and the only way I can put it, it's like a different language. When graffiti started and people were writing their names on walls and trains of London, New York, wherever, there was no connectivity to civilians. There was no connectivity to sell something or to make a byproduct of. It was art for the people and the practitioners who were doing it. We did it for each other. We couldn't give a flying shit if Joe Schmo, who lives at number 42 Acacia Avenue, could read it. It didn't matter. It wasn't for him. It wasn't for, you know, Mrs. Gertrude Mills, who lived at number 85. It wasn't for her. It was for graffiti writers. And it was a coded language, you know, like the only people that could read it were graffiti writers. Now, street art is, and don't get me wrong, you know, like there are people who are probably the godfathers of street art, like John Feckner. I don't know if you know John Feckner. Yeah, he's one of my best friends, you know, and I love him so dearly, and he's such an important artist. But he is like the pivot of that shift to street art from graffiti. He was linked with both. He was in shows at PS1 and Fun Gallery with graffiti writers. You know, they were moving in the same circles. They were involved in the same conversations. Years later, you know, this kind of like post Banksy street art explosion, it's a bit Disney, you know, because even Banksy was a writer. Banksy was writing his name. I mean, he'll tell you he wasn't a particularly good writer, which is why he developed something new. And he's very good at adapting, but it's a bit Disney. And it doesn't necessarily have the language or the code that graffiti had. It's just very different. And the only analogy I could use, it's like playing a guitar. Listening to Jose Gonzalez and, you know, the lead guitarist from Coldplay. They're very different guitarists. And maybe that is a diss to Coldplay. I don't mean it as a diss to Coldplay, but he's not Jose Gonzalez. And, you know, to be Jose Gonzalez, he would have to go and study that instrument for a fucking long time to be able to play the way Jose Gonzalez does. And that's the only analogy I can give. I hope that in some way makes sense.
It does. It suggests then that there are sort of there are different groups of people within this world who have different opinions as to what it means and where it comes from. How would you sort of encapsulate, what does street art mean to you and its kind of role in society right now?
I mean, it's populist, you know, and that's the thing. Graffiti was never populist. It isn't populist. It was never a popularity contest. A very good friend of mine, an artist from Australia called Stormy Mills, it's one of his favourite lines he always quotes to me. He's like, you know, it's not a popularity contest. Street art is populist. It captures the imagination of people who are passing by it. It's environmental, you know, it becomes part of people's environment. And, you know, don't get me wrong, there are things that I do that kind of come under that banner. You know, I don't refer to myself as a street artist. A lot of people do, you know, even doing this project for this brand, you know, they're kind of like, you know, the press release refers to me as a street artist about 10 times. And I'm a bit like, oh, I'm not. But then I guess I kind of am. It's, you know, it makes it easier to kind of have that conversation with people. It's like easy listening for Armageddon, if you want.
So yeah, I was gonna say, in that sense, does it actually matter?
I don't think it does. You know, at the end of the day, I make art, and that's all that matters. And most of the practitioners of making art make art. I don't care what people's background is. If people make good art, you know, if they're a street artist, if they're graffiti artists, if they potter around in their shed, it matters not one iota to me. I think quality of what you make, what you do, and how you put it across, and having some kind of ethic in what you do, I think it's to me, it's all that matters.
You have changed styles multiple times, and you sort of described. You described, I suppose, on sort of macro level how that occurs. But what was sort of the inspiration behind moving from one to the other very distinct style and approach?
I mean, I wouldn't say I've ever per se changed style. I've evolved styles, and I think if you look at the, I mean, I wouldn't say I've ever per se changed style. I've evolved styles, and I think if you look at the kind of work that I've done from, you know, like probably mid-90s, which is when I actually thought I did quite decent work. Prior to that, I doubt it. So kind of mid-90s to now, there are transitional points in everything. It's you know, it's like a timeline, and you can see where, you know, for example, you know, through the 90s, you can see how my lettering evolved and how, you know, my composition evolved. And that composition completely goes through into my more abstract work. Now, I was doing abstract work in the 80s. I was doing whole abstract graffiti walls. And very, very few people were doing abstract graffiti at that point. I was very influenced by an artist from Birmingham that I met in 1989 in a place called Bridlington in Yorkshire. Don't ask why. But they were having, well, I'll tell you what, they were having the for some reason, it was the spot of the Graffiti World Championships. And I was there, you know, we were supposed to be involved in the project, but, you know, there was some weird political thing that happened and it all went weird. And I was like, okay, fine, no worries. But I was walking around this place looking at all these people painting, and I met this crazy black guy I thought was like a weird preacher. And I started talking to him and I showed him this artwork that we were supposed to paint at this event. But the organisers had said, well, no, you can't do it now. And, you know, for whatever reason, that was that. And he was like, got up on the JCB and he was like, look at this. This is really fresh. And anyway, he's still one of my best friends now. And he was pivotal in educating me on all the aspects of graffiti that I didn't know. And people like Futura 2000, Ramel Z, people who were left of field, but still within our movement. And from that point in '89, I started experimenting a lot more with what I was doing with spray paint. And all of that work still is referenced in what I do now. You know, even if it's in the kind of the color schematics that I use, or the visualization of how I was composing things. You know, because composition is such a key important thing with graffiti. You know, you go with a sketch this big, you know, an A5 sketch, and you blow it up to, you know, the size of a 20-foot wall. You know, you need to understand composition, you need to understand scaling. And you know, I always remember like somebody saying to me, oh, you know, kids, yeah, they got nothing, they can't do anything. And I used to always want to say to people, it's like, I go out with a bag of paint, and I create a huge 20-foot wall from this A5 sketch. And I do it. I get up early, I go out, I do it off my own speed, you know, off my own back. I'm doing something. I'm a kid. So I always kind of wanted to argue with people about that. But yeah, I was doing abstract work then. So I mean, going back to what you were saying, it's always evolved, and there are transitional points in everything. And because I'm always searching for something, I often find things and move to them, but try and transition to them rather than jump to them, if that makes any sense. Because I don't just, you know, I see a lot of great abstract art nowadays, but you know, where does it come from? You know, like you look at Malevich. Malevich was painting portraits. You know, you look at, you know, I don't know, Picasso. You know, Picasso was painting just normal paintings, and before he, you know, found his way into Cubism, it's like, you know, it has to come from somewhere. And I can show literally physically where my work comes from in every aspect. And that's quite important to me.